Welcome to DC Shmooze with OU Advocacy. We're getting to know some of our nation's elected leaders and learning about their policy goals. Join us as we dive in.
Hello, this is Nathan Diamond, Executive Director of the Orthodox Union Advocacy Center, and welcome to another episode of the DC Shmooze. I am here today with Barak Ravid, a longtime journalist in Israel, currently a Middle East correspondent for Axios, the Washington political and policy news source. And Barak is soon relocating, actually, to Washington, D.C. To cover foreign policy more broadly for Axios. He recently had his book, which was published several months ago in Ivrit, translated into English and now published in English. It's called Trump's Peace, the Abraham Accords and the Reshaping of the Middle East. And I'm pleased to welcome Barak Ravid onto the Shmooze. Welcome. Shalom.
Hi, Nathan. Thanks for having me. It's really great being here.
Thanks so much for taking some time. I'd actually like to start off where your book ends. When you wrote the book, you did not, I think, have a section on President Biden because he hadn't come in, or he had just come in. And you added on very helpfully a few chapters at the end for the English translation about Biden. And we're in the middle of a lot of things going on with regard to the Biden administration in Israel. So maybe we can start there and then go back in time.
Sure.
So, if I had to shorthand where we are from my perspective in the Biden administration's relations with Israel, I think I would hit like 3 points. One is they came in saying they wanted to restart a nuclear deal with Iran, but that has not happened.
Yeah.
Right?
To say the least.
That has not happened. They said they want to build on and expand the Abraham Accords. And there's been a lot of talk about that, but that has not yet happened. And in fact, just this week, there were two members of Congress, Republican Mike Lawler and Democrat Richie Torres, who introduced legislation to establish a specific person at the State Department to be the special envoy for the Abraham Accords. And maybe that's a sign that not much has happened. And then thirdly, there's been some back and forth with the president and American officials with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government over the judicial reform. And that's been a little bit bumpier maybe than the first two things. But maybe you can, from your perspective and your in-depth reporting, where do you see us on those 3 points? And is there something maybe that I didn't mention that we really should focus on in terms of what's shaping the relationships right now between the American and Israeli governments?
Well, let's start with the last point you mentioned about the judicial reform, because I think it's actually connected. Because when Biden assumed office, it was still Prime Minister Netanyahu. A few months later, we had our elections.
It was Prime Minister Bennett.
No. When Biden started, it was Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Oh, you're right. I apologize.
It was Prime Minister Netanyahu. Then we had our elections, and Netanyahu left office. There was Prime Minister Bennett. Then, shortly before Biden visited Israel, we had another government fell, and then we had the acting Prime Minister, Yair Lapid. A few months later, once again, Netanyahu is the Prime Minister. So, in a nutshell, Joe Biden, who is has a long record on Israel, he knows everybody here, he knows the issues, but I think that what he saw just in those first 2 years in office is how much the Israeli political system is dysfunctional, how destabilized it has become. And I think when Netanyahu came back to office, one of the things that I know that Biden and his people said is, you know what, maybe at least now there'll be some stability. So we want to use that in order not to, we don't want to go back again to, fighting over things. We want to try and, build this path of finding a positive agenda. And they said, our positive agenda is, first, obviously, the Abraham Accords, trying to get a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And second, working with Israel on Iran, because A, there's no nuclear deal. It doesn't seem that there's going to be anytime soon. And the Iranians are cooperating with Russia in Ukraine. So in a way, the field was really, set in a very positive way for doing great things together. But then in the first week of January, a few days after Netanyahu assumed office, the Israeli government launched its judicial reform. And in a way, this judicial reform not only hijacked Prime Minister Netanyahu's own agenda, the one that he announced in his inauguration speech, it also hijacked all the plans that the White House had for the relationship. So I think that right now, when we see that the judicial reform is suspended, and at least my assessment is that it's not gonna go back to the table in any major way in the next few months. And, maybe if it's up to Netanyahu, maybe never. Okay? I think that brings us back to where we were 4 months ago. We wasted 4 months, but I think right now things are going back to dealing with those two things that the two countries need to do together. A peace deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and a joint strategy on how to counter Iran that is, pretty close to getting a nuclear weapon. So both countries actually can't waste any time on, issues that are just a distraction from the real strategic and existential things that they should deal with, and again, each of us has its own, position and opinion about judicial reform, but I think that we can all agree that this is not the, let's say, number one priority right now for Israel. We see it in the polls here in Israel when people are asked, what's the top priority? Judicial reform is not in the first 5. And there are much more pressing issues that are of an existential nature, and judicial reform is not one of them.
Although it might be the number one priority for some of Netanyahu's coalition partners,
Definitely,
who are essential for him staying in power. So that's the rock and the hard place that he's in.
Definitely, I totally agree. But I think that sometimes, we, as a journalist who covers politics, I need to admit that sometimes we cover politics too much. And because we cover politics too much, we give more importance sometimes to mundane statements that have nothing to do with reality. And when you look at reality, you see that nobody in the current Israeli government has anywhere to go. All of the people in the current government have more power than they ever dreamt. So I think that, we hear a lot of talk, a lot of noise. Nobody has a better alternative. And the people who are now in the coalition, neither of them has a better alternative, and Netanyahu knows it. And I think that after, let's say, not the best beginning to his term, I think that he's starting to get his act together, and also sending the message to his coalition partners that, with all due respect, they're not the prime minister, and he's the one who has 30 plus seats in the coalition, and therefore he needs to be the one calling the shots. And I think that we will see more and more of that in the coming weeks and months.
Interesting. Okay, so then let's take the premise that there's going to be more time and more energy to focus on expanding the Abraham Accords, and particularly with the top target, so to speak, being Saudi Arabia. That's an interesting place to go back to a lot of the story that you tell in your book. A lot of this came out in the Hebrew edition and is now maybe more accessible. Is more accessible to a broader audience in the English edition. In that, and the story. Tell me if I'm saying this correctly in a sentence, right? That people might not be aware of or aware of to a limited degree is the Abraham Accords were sort of born out of you could call it necessity, or you could even call it a little bit of a crisis in between Netanyahu and his team and Trump and his team in the context of President Trump rolling out his Mideast peace plan that Jared Kushner and Avi Berkowitz and Jason Greenblatt had developed. If that's the headline, maybe you could fill in like the opening paragraph of that for people who are listening.
Yeah, I think that what I learned when I worked on the book, and I interviewed dozens of people who were involved, and President Trump himself spoke with twice, and obviously Jared Kushner and Avi Berkowitz and Jason Greenblatt and many others. And what I learned was, and I was amazed how we, at least I'm talking about myself, my sense about the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump and between the Israeli government and the Trump administration, that was very, very close, almost with no daylight. And when I worked on the book, I discovered how much daylight there was behind the scenes. And I mean, how many differences and how many gaps and how many clashes there were behind the scenes. And the Abraham Accords were born out of one of those clashes. Because if you remember, in May 2020, after three election campaigns, one after the other, finally there was a unity government in Israel between Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. And one of the main parts of the coalition agreement was the issue of the possible annexation of parts of the West Bank. And Netanyahu put this sort of an artificial deadline on this thing for July 1st, 2020. Nobody knew why. When Benny Gantz told me that when he asked Yariv Levin, was then the Speaker of Knesset, why, and was negotiating the deal, he asked him, why July 1st? What's the story here? So he told him, things that you don't do fast, you never do. And they try to do it very, very fast. But at the same time, Donald Trump and the Trump administration were, it was COVID, there were 10,000 other things on their plate, an election was coming, and nobody in the White House had an appetite to go for a move that, with the quite good chance of, unraveling a lot of things in the region. They don't need this before an election. So they were trying to, at the same time, get Netanyahu off the tree of the annexation without getting into, a public clash with him that might influence politics in America. And Netanyahu also didn't want to clash with Trump, but he was also sort of, boxed in by his own campaign promises and coalition agreements. And from this point of both two trains that are, driving towards each other, and there's like, you can see this train wreck coming, at that point on July 1st, 2020, the day that Netanyahu set as the day for doing the annexation, obviously it didn't happen on July 1st, but at that day, the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates, Yusuf El-Utaiba, came with an idea to Avi Berkowitz and Jared Kushner and told them, what if we normalize relations with Israel, full normalization, peace agreement, and Netanyahu drops the annexation. And at that moment, it was like really this almost magic solution that can prevent this clash between the Trump administration and Netanyahu, get everybody off the tree, and create, this new amazing breakthrough in Middle East peace. And I think that at first, when Netanyahu was told about this idea on July 2nd, at first he didn't know how to digest, if he believes that it's serious or not. But then when he was convinced, there was a really dramatic period of like 6 weeks of negotiating on what's going to be the deal itself, with like more than 115 drafts of the agreement. And in those 6 weeks, it was so dramatic, and nobody knew about it in real time. Nobody even knew. Everybody still thought in real time that annexation is coming. And then on August 13th, President Trump announced that instead of annexation, there's a historic peace deal. And what I learned when I was writing the book is how many ups and downs were during those 6 weeks. For example, when Netanyahu, a day before the announcement of the Abraham Accords on August 12th, he sends Ron Dermer, who was then the ambassador to Washington, he sends them to the White House to basically tell Jared Kushner that, you know what, we decided we don't want it. And Kushner was shocked because everything was ready. I mean, in the president's schedule, there was a phone call with Netanyahu and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed. Everything was set. And then David Friedman, who was then the U.S. ambassador to Israel, was sent to basically tell Bibi, you can't backtrack now. That's too late. The train has left the station. And it was such a dramatic moment that each of the people who were involved in that point in time remembers it almost as a trauma. That it was because it was this point that everything could have unraveled, and we would go from a historic peace deal to a historic farce. And eventually it didn't happen. Everything was okay. They announced the deal. But I think that, again, I discovered how many things we did not know in real time.
And the story goes back even earlier than that, late spring and summer, right? Because when it was in January that that President Trump at the White House with Prime Minister Netanyahu was announcing the Trump Middle East peace plan, and that was you narrate in your book how that was a moment which laid the seeds for what you just described, right? Because Netanyahu was still not only anticipating annexation, but he thought that he had the green light from the White House on annexation. And in fact, I remember I was there as you were and many others that day. After the ceremony, a number of us, almost immediately after the ceremony, a number of us had a meeting with Ambassador David Friedman, in which he was laying out to some Jewish organizational representatives, and there were also some evangelical representatives in the room. He was laying out, what the next steps and what the points of this were, and that was before the story that you tell of what happened over the course of the rest of the day. Because the story we heard from Ambassador Friedman in the immediate aftermath of the ceremony was quite different from what transpired the rest of the day. Maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit more about how things played out after that.
Yeah, this was a crazy day. And, in many rounds of Middle East peace talks or peace plans or whatever, there's always those points that people have contradicting narratives, and that they will never agree on them to the rest of their lives.
Right.
It does, and it's the same people who were at the same time in the same place, but each of them has a completely contradictory narrative of what happened, and this is one of those cases. And for me personally, January 28, 2020 was one of the worst days in my career. And I'll tell you why. Because the night before, I get a call, or I spoke to somebody from the White House who basically said that they're not going to allow annexation right away, that it's not part of the plan. Maybe in the future they're not, they didn't have anything against it, but at this point in time, it's not part of the plan. I checked it with a few other sources. They all said, yes, that's the position. So the next day, 2 hours before the ceremony starts, in the briefing room at the White House, back then I worked for Channel 13 in Israel, and I stood in front of the camera and published a story that the White House is against it. And then, as you said, right after the ceremony, David Friedman said they can go and do it right away. Then I remember walking from the White House to the Blair House right across the street for a briefing with Netanyahu. And Netanyahu, in the briefing, said, we're going to do it on Sunday, it was then, I think it was a Tuesday. He said, we're going to do it on Sunday, something like that, in 5 days.
Right.
And then he pointed at me and said, there's somebody here in the room that published that the White House is not allowing me to do it. I'm doing it on Sunday. This was fake news. And, I was shocked because, my feeling was that, the story I ran was not true. And for me, at least, it was to run such a dramatic story at such a dramatic moment, and it's not true. I literally decided in my head that if this is really not true, that the moment I come back to Israel, I'm going to resign. That was my plan.
Wow.
And then a few hours later, I was sitting with a friend of mine in Bistro de Croix. It's a restaurant in DuPont. And I was, telling him how much I'm depressed and I don't know what to do. And then all of a sudden, he gets like a push notification on his phone from an interview of Jared Kushner with CNN, with Christiane Amanpour. And she asks him, she said, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that on Sunday he's going to announce annexation in the cabinet meeting. And Kushner says, I know nothing about any annexation in the near future, which was, completely contradictory. And then 2 hours later, like it was almost midnight, I get a call from somebody from the White House telling me, listen, we know that you feel very, very bad and you think that you were wrong. You were not wrong. Wait till tomorrow morning. Next morning, David Friedman does a conference call with reporters and basically walking back the whole thing, which obviously was a big relief for me because I realized that the story I ran was true.
Not so happy. But, not so happy a moment for David Friedman, though.
Yeah, but I gotta say something again. One of the things I learned while researching for this book is that the answer to the question of, what really happened is very complicated. Meaning, I think that both Netanyahu and Friedman and Kushner think that how they saw the situation, how they read the situation is the truth. Nobody, I don't think anybody is like lying here or anything. I just think that it was
trying to pull a fast one over the other people. They all thought they were all...
Yeah. So I think it was really a big misunderstanding, which, by the way, it's it doesn't have, it should have been that way. I think it wasn't like a tornado that it's from force majeure. What can you do? It's like, I think it was they needed to deal with that better. I'll give you an example. One of the things that Netanyahu asked for is a exchange of letters with President Trump. In his letter, Netanyahu wrote that he's going to do the annexation move within, I can't remember, in the next few weeks or next few days. I can't remember what was the exact, but there was a time frame, okay, which was very short. in the letter President Trump gave Netanyahu back, there was no reference to a time frame. So I think that in Netanyahu's head, he said, all right, I gave a time frame. I did not get pushback. Okay. And in the White House mind, they gave the letter back, but they did not mention a time frame.
Right.
So I think that it was, this thing could have been handled better, but, it was a super dramatic night on, January 28th I think it was one of Netanyahu's worst nights as prime minister, because especially you have to remember, this is a few weeks before an election.
Right.
And Netanyahu just agreed to a map of a Palestinian state. And he promised his people, his voters, his supporters, that there's going to be annexation in return. And then he goes back to Israel with basically nothing. And not only with nothing, but with a crisis with the White House. And I think that the next few weeks until the Israeli election were the worst period in the relationship between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government. A few days before the election, Ron Dermer comes to the White House to speak with Kushner after a few weeks that they were out of touch with each other. And this meeting ends with Kushner throwing Dermer out of his office. This is how bad things were at that time. And when you think about it, from February, March 2020, when it was a real low in the relationship, to a few months later to get to the height of the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu with the Abraham Accords, it just shows you how dramatic this period in time was.
Yeah, and dramatic, and also it would seem, I think it seems to me and many observers, I don't know what your thoughts are, they had that miscommunication and that crisis not occurred, you might not have gotten to the Abraham Accords 3 or 4 months later. In other words, the Abraham Accords came as a creative solution, to a problem that all these parties had, and
Totally.
and got everybody off the hook, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. In ways that might not have been necessary if, either if Trump had got along with annexation, I mean, that would have been a whole different scenario. But even if they hadn't sort of teed it up, altogether, you might not have gotten the Abraham Accords.
I totally agree. It was, in a way, also, without Trump putting his plan, laying out his peace plan, regardless of if you think it's a good plan, it's a bad plan, it doesn't matter. But without doing that step, okay, and without the Palestinians basically rejecting it out of hand, this process allowed a lot of Arab states that were waiting for him to lay down his plan, allowed them to say, well, we waited, we were willing to engage on the plan, even if we did not agree with any a paragraph in the plan. We were ready to engage. The Palestinians didn't want to engage. So, I mean, we can't just give a veto to the Palestinians over our national security policy.
Right.
So I think this was.
In the few minutes we have left, let's just go back to where we are now with this very, very helpful background. So again, President Biden and his team have broadly said they applaud the Abraham Accords from the last administration. They want to build on them. They want to do the Saudi Arabia deal. Obviously, there have been some challenges there, not only for the thing itself, but also because of bilateral relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia, whether it's with regard to issues like oil production or with regard to Iran or others. Where do you see we are right now, coming into late spring and summer of 2023? There's an American election off in the distance. Who knows about an Israeli election when that might come around again? But
I hope not.
Yeah,
I hope not.
I think all Israelis hope not. But where do you think we are, and what do you think are the one or two things that you'll be looking to see President Biden or Secretary Blinken do in, let's say, the next 1, 2, or 3 months to really try to, if they're really trying to push this, what do they need to be doing?
Okay, so first let's go back to the to the beginning of the Biden administration. Biden was very quick to endorse the Abraham Accords when he was just candidate for president. He supported what Trump did. The Abraham Accords, I think, were the only thing Trump did that got Biden's support. And so when he came into office, he did not roll back any of the tangible deliverables that the U.S. gave the countries that were involved in the Abraham Accords. And everyone were, a lot of people were concerned that he might do that, like the Western Sahara to Morocco, or the F-35 to the UAE, or the aid package to Sudan. Nothing of that was rolled back when Biden came into office. But still, there was an issue of, for example, just using the term Abraham Accords, that the administration in the first 6 months or 9 months didn't use this term. It used the term normalization agreements, normalization process, whatever you want to call them. And it was, maybe a small thing, but it showed that still there was some, they weren't all in on it. By the way, I can understand them, because the Israeli government, headed by Naftali Bennett, did almost the same thing, because like the Biden administration saw it as Trump's legacy. Bennett saw it as Netanyahu's legacy. And Bennett, in his first 3 months in office, did not use the term Abraham Accords. And it was, one of Bennett's aides told me that even there was like a huge discussion on whether to issue a statement on the first anniversary of the Abraham Accords. And it took like a lot of, some of Bennett's aides said that they shouldn't put out a statement. Eventually, he put out a statement. But so it was an issue. But I think that in the first anniversary, this changed for the Biden administration. It was as if somebody, turned on the light. And since then, I think the Biden administration is doing much more. It's trying to work on this issue. It tried to press Indonesia to go for some sort of a deal. Mauritania, it, I think, had a big achievement when Biden came to the region. This agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia on the Red Sea Islands, and the Saudi deliverable of allowing Israeli airlines to use Saudi airspace. This was a big deal. We, in a way, after having, peace agreements with 3.5 Arab countries, so, all of a sudden, when you don't get the full peace deal, you feel that it's meaningless. Okay, because we got so jaded about this thing. It's a good thing, but still, when you think about it, this deal with Saudi Arabia was a big deal. Saudi Arabia is the leader of the Arab world, the leader of the Sunni world. That's, it's a big deal, even if it's not a full agreement. But I think that right now, after more than 2 years in office, almost 3 years, I think the Biden administration, recalculates its policy in the Middle East and its relations with Saudi Arabia. And I think the White House sees a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia as a way not only to get normalization between those two countries, but as a way to reset Saudi-U.S. relations. And more importantly, I think, here in Israel, nobody even looks at it that way, but obviously in America, that's the number one issue. This is part of the big power competition with China. The U.S., the White House believes that by doing such a deal, you basically send the message to China that the U.S. is still the biggest force in the Middle East, especially when it comes to Saudi Arabia and energy and, the biggest economy in the region, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is what the White House wants to do. It's the number one goal in the Middle East for the next 6 months for Biden. I think Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, sends messages that he is willing to do it. Netanyahu obviously wants to do it, but for each of those leaders, there are pitfalls. For Biden, this means legitimizing Mohammed bin Salman, inviting him to the White House. That's a big deal in an election year. For Mohammed bin Salman, it's obviously normalizing with Israel. That's a big deal. And for Netanyahu, I think the big deal will be on two things. First, it's obvious to everybody that you can't go for such a deal when Israel is destabilized domestically because of judicial reform. So I think that it's obvious that, to do that, he needs to say goodbye to this idea. And second, there will have to be some sort of a Palestinian component in this deal, even if it's just a symbolic or small one. And I'm not sure that the current Israeli government is able to withstand such a thing, which means that maybe you'll need to have some sort of a political change in Israel with a new coalition. So I think when you take all of that together, we're looking at some pretty hectic 6 months in front of us when there is a real opportunity to do it, but this also has to do with a lot of political cost for the three different leaders.
Right. Well, thank you. I think we brought this conversation full circle, so I think that's a good place to conclude. Again, the book by Barak Ravid is called Trump's Peace, The Abraham Accords and the Reshaping of the Middle East. It's available on Amazon. And for those who tune into the OUDC Shmooze and have not already read it in Hebrew, you can now read it in English if you wish. Barak Ravid of Axios, we really appreciate you joining us here today. I'm Nathan Diamond, Executive Director of the OU Advocacy Center. Thank you very much.